Hello and welcome to How to Fix It. It should come as no surprise to any of you that I'm not really that adept with horror. What can I say? I prefer sci-fi movies to slasher movies. That fact is no more apparent in the realization that the only horror stuff that we've showcased on this channel were the horror classics, like Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Goosebumps. But there is one show that I'd love to watch around Halloween that does feature horror elements. The Munsters, which you may know if you used to watch WGN's yearly marathon on Halloween, and if you've never seen it, you probably know the theme song, as it's pretty well known, and it was sampled for that new Fall Out Boy song. She wants to dance like Uma Thurman, bury me till I confess. The Munsters is one of my all-time favorite classic TV shows, and it does feature horror elements, in that all of the main characters are parodies of the Universal monsters. The Munsters was a satire of both traditional monster movies and the wholesome family sitcoms of the time, like Leave It to Beaver and The Andy Griffith Show. The joke is that the entire family are monsters, with the family patriarch Herman, played by Fred Gwynne, being a Frankenstein's monster, his wife Lily, played by Yvonne DiCarlo, being a vampire, along with her father Grandpa, played by Al Lewis, who might be Count Dracula, as the show alludes to that many times, but it's never confirmed, and Herman and Lily's son Eddie, played by Butch Patrick, who is a werewolf. The only regular person in their family is Marilyn, first played by Beverly Owen, who left and was replaced by Pat Priest, who is their niece and known among them as the Ugly One, since she looks normal and they don't. The show featured them just being themselves and being a working-class family of the 60s, while dealing with the effects of their town's reactions to them, and also the antics of Grandpa when he does experiments in his lab. So, the Munsters had pretty decent ratings in the 60s, running from 1964 to 66, and being tied with Gilligan's Island during its first season. The show was cancelled during its second season due to a drop in ratings when the Adam West Batman show premiered, since that was in color and the Munsters were in black and white and people just liked Batman better. So the original show was over, but that didn't mean the show was dead and buried, pun completely intended. The Munsters came back for movies in 1966 with Munster Go Home, featuring the entire original cast, save for Pat Priest as Marilyn, 1973 with The Mini Munsters, which was an animated TV movie featuring only Al Lewis returning to voice Grandpa, and 1981 with The Munsters Revenge, featuring some of the original cast, Fred Gwynne as Herman, Yvonne DiCarlo as Lily, and Al Lewis as Grandpa, but replacing Pat Priest yet again as Marilyn, and also replacing Butch Patrick as Eddie. So why am I giving you this lecture about the history of a show that I doubt you care about? Well, after those movies, the show ended up returning to the airwaves when they made the sequel series The Munsters Today, featuring the family, although none of the original cast, making their way through the then modern day of the late 80s/early 90s. But how do you reboot a series about people who look/act like the Universal monsters and set it in a contemporary time period? Well, there are a few ways to skin a cat.
Oh, yes, and I know all of them. My favorite way is you take the cat.
So let's look at one of them and get into The Munsters Today. So, I gave you the crash course on the original Munsters, but what about the Munsters of today, or rather 1988? The show had an entirely new cast, featuring John Schuck as Herman, who you might recognize as the painless Pole from the Robert Altman MASH film, or as the angry Klingon ambassador from Star Trek IV, or Drawl on Babylon 5. He's been in a lot of stuff. Lily is now played by Lee Merriweather, who ironically played Catwoman on the Adam West Batman show. Howard Morton took over for Al Lewis as Grandpa, which I believe is blasphemy, as no actor should be able to play Grandpa except for Al Lewis. And that includes Eddie Izzard, dammit. Hilary Van Dyke, no relation to Dick Van Dyke, now plays Marilyn, and Eddie is now played by Jason Marsden. otherwise known as every single sitcom guest star of the 90s, appearing on Boy Meets World, Full House, and Step by Step, along with later voicing Tino on The Weekenders and Richie on Static Shock. The basic plot goes like this. In the first episode, it opens up in the 60s, as Grandpa asks the family to test out his new sleeping chambers, and he sets it for a half hour. However, something goes wrong, and they end up asleep indefinitely. 22 years pass, and the house has gone into disrepair, and a land developer, played by the manager from the Partridge Family, accidentally turns the machine off, freeing them. They struggle to find their footing in the 80s, with the first episode featuring them trying to get their house back from the bank, except they don't have the money, until Herman goes to the bank and discovers that their untouched bank account had the money they needed. Herman even gets his old job back at the crematorium, since no one since him was as passionate about his job. And that's essentially the plot. The Munsters living in the 80s, learning new things like the fashion, lingo, and even getting Grandpa dabbling in video dating. Well, it follows the plot of the Munsters pretty well. It does its job as a sequel. I'll admit at first that I wasn't too confident, but it's actually a pretty decent show. The writing is okay, and actually manages to do at least some development on the characters, especially with Grandpa in the video dating episode. Plus, while the cast isn't on par with the originals, they at least try. Lee Merriweather is a fantastic actress, and my second favorite Catwoman. I was already a fan of Jason Marsden, and he does the role of Eddie Justice. And Howard Morton doesn't do that bad as Grandpa. I mean, he actually seems like he's trying to match Al Lewis's mannerisms. And I will say that John Schuck, who I like as an actor, does a decent job as Herman. He gets the dopiness down almost as well as Fred Gwynn and nearly nails the character. Plus, they kept the relationship between Herman and Grandpa, where Grandpa is insulting and sarcastic towards him, but still likes him as a person. Oh, and Marilyn's best friend Howie Buchanan is played by Richard Stephen Horvitz, otherwise known as Invader Zim in Alpha 5. So this show automatically gets brownie points for that. The jokes are also pretty good. Sometimes they're hit or miss, but they get the concept of the showdown with the jokes deriving from them not understanding normal customs and perceiving the outside world as peculiar. The episodes are also pretty creative, although some of them do borrow plot elements from episodes of the original, like Ode to Munster, featuring the same love potion gimmick from the episode My Fair Munster, the second episode of the original show. Other ones were semi-creative, like the video dating episode, or the one where a bank robber has to pose as a distant family member to find money he stashed away while the Munsters were asleep in the basement. The show also stays true to the concept of being a satire of sitcoms of the time. It's not really a satire of 60s sitcoms, but it is of 80s and 90s sitcoms, although one can argue that Munsters Today embraces the tropes of the thing they're parodying more than the original did. And they did stay pretty consistent with the costumes, with most of them remaining in their original costumes during the show, or some variation upon it. Unlike another Munsters reboot I can think of. The show looks dated as hell. Like, seriously, the show from the 60s looked less dated than this thing. It's especially apparent with Marilyn as she dresses the most contemporary, and a lot of the jokes are dated as well, 'cause, 80s. Oh, and the effects are lackluster at best. I mean, look at the original Herman in the 1960s, and look at the new Herman. I mean, I get it. The show was syndicated for its entire run, so it probably didn't have a budget, but still. And Marilyn is completely dumbed down for the series. She's a stereotypical dumb blonde, when the original Marilyn was anything but dumb. It's not like she was a Nobel Prize winner, but she was pretty well read. I'll admit they didn't develop her very well in the original, but at least she was intelligent. Also, the theme song.
We're the Munsters.
We're the Munsters.
We went to sleep many years ago, and we woke up with a brand new show.
I get it, they need to give exposition, but there are good ways to do expositional theme songs, like Gilligan's Island or the Animaniacs, and bad ways, like Hammerman and the Munsters Today. I'll give it this, at least the Munsters Today is a short song. And thankfully, they did away with the lyrics after the first season. Also, the show has a ton of continuity errors, and by the time it gets to the third season, it's basically a reboot of the original since they essentially abandoned the whole asleep for 22 years in the basement plotline. Other than that, there's not much bad I can say about it. The show would have been improved with more of the original cast, and that's a given. But if there was no way to get the cast, I'd improve the budget to get more decent effects. And I'll give the show credit, most of those issues were fixed by the third season. Plus, I'd have stuck with the original concept of the whole adjusting to the future thing, because that's an interesting concept to explore, that I feel the show could have done more with, like having characters from the original show up, like their family doctor, Dr. Dudley, or their mean neighbor, Mrs. Cribbins. Also, I'd have changed Marilyn back to her original personality. And as a fan of the original, I'd have kept the continuity errors in check, like how at one point they stated that Herman and Lily had been married for 300 years, when in the original it was only 100. Other than that, the show wasn't all that bad, and most of the stuff was fixed by the time it ended, so that's about all I can say for the fix.
We're the Munsters.
We're the Munsters.
Oh, yeah!
That was the Munsters Today. Was it bad? No, actually it was pretty good. Would it have been better with Fred Gwynne and the rest of the original cast? Probably. But the show wasn't all that bad. It was a sequel, and as a sequel series, it did pretty good. It even did pretty good as a reboot of the show. And it didn't do half bad in the ratings, running for one more season than the original had. And if it lasted longer than the original, it had to have been doing something right. I don't like it better than the original Munsters, but it's definitely a fitting and appropriate revisiting of the world of the Munsters. This is something I don't get to say often, but if you want to see it, you can check out the entire series, save for the unaired pilot, which is on YouTube, on Hulu. Yeah, Hulu. Not being sponsors to say that, just telling you where to find the show. Also, check out the original Munsters when it airs sporadically on TV or on Netflix if you have it. It's really good. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of how to fix it, you can hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. See you next time for our annual Halloween book review. I just know you're gonna love what I've crafted.
We're the Munsters.
We're the Munsters.
We went to sleep many years ago, and we woke up with a brand new show. We're the Munsters.
We're the Munsters.
Oh, yeah!